Hello, history class, and welcome to our Modern Muslim Empires PowerPoint review. Starting us off with PowerPoint question number 1. Despite being slaves, why do you think the Janissaries held such a high position in the Ottoman Empire, and how was this type of slavery different than the kind we have studied in Africa and the New World? To answer this question, I think you really have to begin by looking at the purpose of the slaves in this point in time. As opposed to the Americas, where the primary purpose was for agricultural work, for manual labor, and quite frankly for doing a lot of jobs that European Americans didn't want to do, the Janissaries' primary purpose was to be soldiers, to be an elite fighting force for the empire, as well as to be trained officials within the court. So both soldiers and government officials, just within society in general, have a much higher social status than agricultural workers, which means that even though they were essentially slaves, and the fact that they couldn't choose to just go off and do whatever else they wanted, a lot of times these Janissaries held much more prestige and higher positions within the Ottoman Empire than a lot of the average Ottoman citizens would have held. So something very counterintuitive to what we'd oftentimes think of as slavery and how slavery operates. Also, towards the purpose of this, you have to think that part of the purpose of the Janissaries, particularly being recruited or captured, or kind of a tribute system from Christian families within Eastern Europe, was the fact that this was kind of a way to secure loyalty of those Christians, knowing that they essentially had their children. But at the same point in time, even though they were essentially kind of stealing their children from them or forcing them to hand them over, they would have known that their children were essentially going to be taken care of, that they weren't going to be, brutalized, they weren't going to be working in the same kind of slave system that you saw in the Americas, that they were essentially going to be achieving probably a higher status and higher position in life than their parents were going to have, which likely would have led to a less likely chance of rebellion and pushback against this system. I would say another key aspect you have to look at is that the Janissary system was not hereditary. The fact that the Janissaries really were not allowed to form families and so forth made it so that there were very few children, and those children were not then automatically put in a separate class, as you see happening within the Americas, where essentially once slavery becomes hereditary within the enslaved African American population of the New World, that's really when it becomes very standardized and institutionalized, and can go on from generation to another, which, as we were talking about a few weeks ago, is one of the things that really made the slave system in the Americas atypical. Also, that's lacking a certain racial component. Even though the children were coming from a different cultural group, essentially a different religious group, there wasn't this sense of them being as different as you saw occurring with imported enslaved individuals from Africa within the New World and European culture, where there was such a vast difference between the two, or at least a perceived difference with the Europeans, made it very easy to identify who those enslaved individuals were, and the kind of racial justifications that very quickly crept up to justify the abuse that enslaved individuals were being subjected to. Very different with the Janissaries, where there was essentially some amount of cultural difference, but very quickly those children were going to be indoctrinated into the Islamic faith, indoctrinated into essentially their jobs and roles within the Ottoman society, and there wasn't going to be nearly as big of a cultural difference that we see, which is another reason why there was likely much different treatment between these various groups. But something very interesting to think about, the various ways that slavery can, take form across time and through history. Obviously, these are oftentimes very, very brutal and repressive forms of slavery. Even a form like the Janissaries is certainly not without its complications as we would see them today, but certainly very seemingly different than what we think of occurring within the Americas at this point in time. All right, going on to PowerPoint question number 2 here. Compare the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s to Europe in the 1600s, and what similarities and differences do you notice? First of all, you can look at both of them as certainly having the idea of absolute monarchs at the head. This is, of course, the time of the French monarch, the English monarch, um, the Holy Roman Empire, the Prussian monarchs, the Russian monarchs, trying to get as much authority and power underneath them as well. The idea of divine monarchy, or monarchy essentially kind of being gifted to or presented to these rulers in a religious sense from God, very similar to the idea of the Ottoman sultans. Um, I know they're perceived of as being not just having secular authority, but also having religious authority as well, kind of taking on that role of caliphs, and kind of being the caretakers of the Islamic religion. Both of these locations, the Ottoman Empire and lots of the various countries within Europe, were very expansionist. We see the expansion into Eastern Europe, into North Africa on the part of the Ottoman Empire. From Europe's standpoint, we see the expansion into the Americas as well as into East Asia and so forth. Both of them have a lot of social stratification within them. Although the social stratification may have been a bit more rigid within Europe than it was in the Ottoman Empire, we'll certainly see in our document exercise coming up how an observer from Europe classifies there being essentially kind of less social stratification and more of a meritocracy within the Ottoman Empire than existed within Europe. But still, it's a society that is broken down into several different classes of people, with the majority of the wealth and the power residing amongst those who are in the upper class. Both societies are very religious at this point in time. The churches within Europe, as well as the Islamic faith within the Ottoman Empire, having a very profound impact in the way that the laws are constructed, in the way that society is run, as well as the way that the rulers and leaders are ruling their countries. Finally, both of these locations are very globally connected. We see examples of the Ottoman Empire reaching out, engaging in the Columbian Exchange, the popular coffee became, the fact that the turkey was originally domesticated in the Americas, or was grabbed from the Americas, was transferred to the Ottoman Empire, where it became domesticated and bred to a larger, meatier bird, eventually got reintroduced to the Americas. That's why we currently call them turkeys. At the same point in time, of course, Europe very much engaged in this process as well through their new colonies and colonial holdings within the Americas. There's also a lot of differences you could have pointed out. The first one, and perhaps the biggest one, is the idea of centralization. The Ottoman Empire was a much more centralized political state than Europe was. Europe, of course, was broken up between numerous various provinces, kingdoms, countries, empires, and so forth, whereas the Ottoman Empire was always consolidated under kind of one head or one leader. Of course, there's a difference in religion between the two. Primarily, Europe is a Christian continent, whereas the Ottoman Empire is an Islamic empire. But I think there's also a very interesting idea of religious toleration between the two, where there was a lot of warfare and conflict and persecution within Europe of anyone who is not Christian. Within the Islamic Empire at this point in time, within the Ottoman Empire, you did see a lot more religious toleration. Quite often, those who were not Muslim had to pay what was called the jizya, or a small tax, to remain in the country, or to avoid any kind of complications or problems, which of course was still exploitative in its own right, but certainly was a far removed from the Inquisition, for example, within Europe, where there was a wholesale persecution of anyone who is perceived as not just being not Christian, but not worshiping Christianity in the right way. And of course, the Protestant-Catholic split only heightens this, as there's tons and tons of religious persecution. Add on to that the long-term persecution of Jewish populations within Europe, and really you see the Ottoman Empire seeming much more religiously tolerant than Europe during this time period. And even with the taxation, from the Ottoman standpoint, it seemed much more profitable to essentially just, economically benefit from having a multitude of religions within their borders, rather than trying to have to spend the resources and the time trying to crack down and convert those individuals who had no interest in converting. So it's not surprising that within the Ottoman Empire there's far more religious diversity that is maintained than you see within Europe, which very quickly over time is broken down into, yes, Protestant and Catholics, but almost exclusively Christian, with the kind of small, ever persecuted Jewish population being the exception. And of course, we realize that the persecution does not end at this point in time or anytime soon, and ultimately culminates in some incredibly terrible persecutions, which we'll be talking about later in the semester. Treatment of women is another thing that a lot of people brought up within the PowerPoint question, the fact that women generally had more rights under Islamic law and under the Ottoman Empire than they did within Europe. They could own more property. They had a right to divorce oftentimes. And generally, even though they did not hold a lot of primary political positions, generally seemed to have a more larger presence within the public sphere within the Ottoman Empire than you saw typically within Europe. Another big difference is that most of the expansion that was occurring within the Ottoman Empire was occurring close to its borders, right? It was much more of a land empire where it was taking over Eastern Europe, North Africa, but still kind of connected to its home base of Turkey or the Middle East that we think of today. Whereas with the expansion that was taking place in Europe, oftentimes it was taking place overseas. It was developing the trading forts and posts across East Asia and in Africa. It was developing the colonies within the Americas. So much more kind of dispersed empires are being created within Europe as opposed to the Ottoman Empire, which is essentially just expanding off of its one maintained land formation. Plenty more similarities and differences that we could look at, but those are a couple of key ones I wanted to point out. Alright, PowerPoint question number 3. Does the Sunni-Shia conflict resemble the religious conflicts of Europe at this point in time, or at the same time, and why might these conflicts appear similar? I'm hoping that all of you realize the very kind of close comparison between the Sunni-Shiite split and the Catholic-Protestant split that was occurring at Europe at this point in time. There's a lot of comparisons between the two. Certainly there's a dispute between them over religious authority, who should have the right to regulate or control the religion, who is reading and interpreting the religious text, either the Quran or the Bible, correctly, as well as a number of other religious sources and institutions that the two sides increasingly kind of rely on and focus differently on to separate themselves from one another. Also, just like the conflict that we see going on within Europe, the conflict between the Shia and the Sunnis was oftentimes not just a religious conflict, but was a political conflict, where the Ottoman Empire, for example, you see being primarily a Sunni empire, whereas the Safavid Empire is primarily a Shia empire. So that oftentimes these conflicts aren't just out of a religious nature, they're also of a political nature, where the political leaders are fighting against one another. Very similar to what we see happening within Europe, where the Holy Roman Empire very quickly becomes much more of a Protestant country. Same thing with England, whereas France maintains itself as a Catholic country. And one of the reasons why there's just maintained conflict between France and Great Britain over the next couple hundred years, really, at this point in time, is this kind of long-standing religious conflict. Very similar process is playing out here between the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire. So what similarities do you see between the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires? Interestingly enough, and a lot of people pointed this out, did a very good job, they were all formed essentially from relatively newly arrived nomadic groups within the regions. A lot of times these were nomadic groups that came from the steppe lands. Some of them had lived within the areas they eventually took over for a sustained period of time, such as the Ottomans, kind of being a separate group from the Seljuk Turks, and eventually with the decline of the Byzantine Empire, were able to cement themselves in this location that they had been living for quite some time, but really expanding upon that, versus, for example, the Mughal Empire and the Berbers, who really kind of moved in and took over very quickly, setting themselves up as the top or head of a society. Another thing is that each of them were really much kind of building upon long-standing, established traditions of empire building, whether it was the empires in India that the Mughal Empire was able to take over, and the Sultanate, not the Sultanate at that point in time, but the Kingdom of Delhi, versus the Ottoman Empire that was taking advantage of the kind of traditions of the Seljuk Turks, as well as eventually, after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines, and the Safavid Empire kind of taking on the role of the kind of classic Persian territory, from the Ilkhans to the Safavid Empire, and taking on kind of that role. So all of them were building upon long structures of imperial systems that they were able to essentially kind of morph and kind of bend to their own will to a certain degree. A very similar process occurs with the Mongols when they're operating in China, which we talked about earlier in the semester, or if you think about the Manchurians within China as well. Rather similar process where a lot of the underlying cultural and political institutions are being maintained, but the people at the top are able to come in and kind of adjust and adapt to those to a certain degree. Trade and contact, I think, is another important key element and similarity you see between all these. That they were all very much involved in trade and contact with each other, with China, with other locations in India, in East Africa, and increasingly with Europe as well. They were all gunpowder empires, and the fact that they all used gunpowder cannons and were kind of early masters of that technology in order to maintain themselves, in order to spread their conquests and fight their wars, and that was kind of an integral technological advancements that they were all able to use to their advantage. They were all Islamic empires, even though, of course, they came from relatively different kind of Islamic traditions, depending on which location you're talking about, and that's why there was some conflict between them. But all of them were still very much kind of used the Islamic ideology and faith in order to help establish order and run their empires. You also see a large flourishing of art and culture, as well as science within all three of these empires as well, throughout most of the time period that we are talking about here. So just some things that you can really look at to see how these various empires were similar to one another. So PowerPoint question number 5, why do you think these three empires were all able to form in a similar fashion around the same time period? This is a relatively difficult question. I know it's not without having a real detailed knowledge of kind of the political background of the regions. It's kind of hard to piece this together. But I thought a lot of you tried very hard and ended up coming up with some pretty good answers. And pretty much I gave most people credit for just trying to make an attempt to answer this question. First of all, you really do see a shift in kind of the regional power bases that we were talking about in each of them, with the decline of the Mongol empires, with the Ilkhans, the decline of the Seljuk Turks, along with the Byzantine Empire, and the decline of the Kingdom of Delhi in northern India, and really kind of left a power vacuum in a lot of ways that these new kind of incoming powers were able to utilize. The main thing that allowed them to really kind of take advantage of this, I would say, was that idea of them kind of taking over the trading obligations, trading functions, establishing the contacts between Eastern Asia as well as kind of the Middle East. Now this allowed them to become kind of those masters of gunpowder that they were able to use to help kind of take over this territory, to form and sustain themselves once they were entrenched and they were in place. And also the fact that they were able to kind of, to a certain degree compete with one another, but also to a certain degree kind of rely on each other and provide examples to one another of how, the kind of empire should be built, constructed, and run at this period in time. Alright, from there then, we are going to be switching over to looking at our history document, the Turkish letters. So starting off here, under question number 1, how does Busbek describe the Ottoman Empire, and what aspects does he choose to focus on? Oftentimes, like our documents, you're going to be able to find quotations or sections of the document that might apply to various of these. I just broke them down to a couple of key areas that I saw all of you drawing from in your answers for this week. So first thing that Busbek talks about is, at Buda, I made my first acquaintance with the Janissaries. This is the name by which the Turks call the infantry of the Royal Guard. So talking about the Janissaries starts off with. And he goes into some discussion and description of them. A garrison of Janissaries is always stationed at the citadel of Buda. The dress of these men consists of a robe reaching down to the ankles, while to cover their heads they employ a cowl, which by their account was originally a cloak sleeve, part of which contains the head, while the remainder hangs down and flaps against the neck. So kind of describing the fashion or the clothing that these Janissaries are wearing. Interesting that that's one of the things he's looking at and focusing on, particularly the ones that he is coming into contact with. Moving on, he describes some of their behavior, kind of in this this first one kind of interesting how they're kind of acting like they'd like a tip for the services that they're rendering here. He says, after reaching the door, they would stand respectfully with their arms crossed and their eyes bent on the ground, looking more like monks than warriors. On receiving a few small coins, which they had wanted, they bowed again, thanked me in loud tones, and went off, blessing me for my kindness. Now, some people interpreted this as them, somehow begging for this money, that they really needed it. That is because they weren't getting paid enough in their jobs. I don't think it should be interpreted necessarily in that way. I think it's more of a fact that they were kind of used to a culture of reciprocity, where if you provide a service for someone, you get compensated for it, and they were simply expecting their guests to follow through with those same kind of cultural tendencies. Not that they necessarily really needed this money, not that they weren't getting paid enough, but that it was just kind of a cultural way of saying thank you when someone is, essentially kind of being polite to you. It's very similar if you think about it today. If you have someone bring your luggage up to a room in a hotel room, you're kind of expected to tip them. Moving on here, the next thing he really focuses on is the Turkish army and how they conduct their warfare. He says here, the Turkish monarch going to war takes with him over 400 camels, nearly as many baggage mules, of which a great part are loaded with rice and other kinds of grains. Kind of talking about the supply of them. And I think in the next kind of couple sections here, there's another kind of misinterpretation that some people had this week. He starts off by saying here that the invading army carefully abstains from encroaching on its magazines. Magazines here, he's talking about its supplies or its store at the outset. So he's saying that the army is careful from using too much of its supplies at the beginning of the conflict, as they are well aware that when the season for campaigning draws to a close, they will have to retreat over districts wasted by the enemy. And this is really setting up the context for these next two lines here. What he's really saying is that even though they're well supplied, that they're very good at using their supplies and making them stretch, because at the beginning of a conflict, they don't use too much of them, so that as the conflict draws out, for example, a long siege, and the land kind of becomes barren or is wasted by the enemy, as he says, that the army is not going to starve and it's not going to be forced to retreat. It's just kind of the natural process that warfare takes, and rather than criticizing the Sultan here for not bringing enough food or resources or being cheap or anything like that, what he's really saying is that the Ottomans are very, very smart in the way they utilize their resources. They don't use too much at the beginning, and they kind of ration themselves for the long haul. And the next few sentences here really only backed it up. He says, when the Sultan's magazines are opened, a ration just sufficient to sustain life is daily weighted out. Once more, the idea of rationing themselves so they don't use up too much of their supplies, so the army actually doesn't starve, so that they're forced to retreat from a conflict. Once more, he goes on down below to say, sometimes they have to recourse to horse flesh. Dead horses are, of course, plentiful in their great hosts, and such beasts are in good condition when they die, furnish a meal not just to be despised by famished soldiers. Once more, this seems surprising to Busbecq, but this probably shouldn't be surprising to us, realizing that the Ottoman Empire has its roots in kind of the steppeland empires and the kind of great horsemen that lived out there, where horses were pretty much the main way to wealth and power, particularly within the military, and that it was very routine to use horses to survive off of, whether by drinking their blood for water, whether by eating them when they died, and that this would not have been at all unusual for a group that had its roots within a nomadic kind of lifestyle. And certainly was another reason why they were able to keep themselves going and become a very effective army for a sustained period of time. Finally, he goes on to say and talk about kind of how the Ottoman Empire seems to be more of a meritocracy than Europe, meaning that more can be achieved based upon what one has accomplished, what they know, what skills they have, rather than simply the position that they were born into. A lot of people remarked on this for question number 3, which is why I marked more of it, and we'll be going over that shortly. But I just want to point out here that this is certainly one of the topics he talks about. For example, when he says, no distinction is attached to birth among the Turks. The difference to be paid to a man is measured by the position he holds in the public service. So talking more about what he has achieved, not necessarily his birth, and of course he expounds on that. Now, it's important to note that Busbecq here isn't necessarily being 100% accurate, that there was certainly still a lot of social division within the Ottoman Empire, but he is striking enough that he does make a very clear depiction and distinction between what he observes in Europe and what he does observe here. So going on to question number 2, what comparisons does Busbecq make between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, and who does he feel is the more powerful force? Moving down in this paragraph here, he really talks about the contrast that he sees between the two armies. Remember, right above here, he complimented really the Islamic Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, for how well they're able to ration their supplies and maintain control of their army through kind of hard times in a campaign. And this is the main area where he kind of starts his comparison here. He says, from this, you will see that it is the patience, self-denial, and thrift of the Turkish soldier that enables him to face the most trying circumstances. He then goes on to say, what a contrast to our men, talking about the European soldiers. Christian soldiers on campaign refused to put up with their ordinary food and called for thrushes, beneficios, a small bird esteemed a dainty as it feeds on figs and grapes, such like dainty dishes. Now, this is probably an exaggeration that all Christian soldiers are sitting there saying we're not going to fight unless we get thrushes, but he is saying that there's more likelihood that there's going to be complaints on the side of Christian soldiers, that they might have higher expectations going into the conflict than what he was observing with the Ottoman soldiers. He kind of backs us up, talking about kind of the society in general and how kind of this observation of the troops is just a part of that. He says, on their side is a vast wealth of their empire, unimpaired resources, experience and practice in arms, a veteran soldiery, an uninterrupted series of victories, readiness to endure hardship, union, order, discipline, thrift, and watchfulness. All things that he is characterizing within the Ottoman Empire and within the Ottoman military. He compares it then and says, on ours are found an empty exchequer, essentially that's meaning a treasury, so an empty treasury as opposed to kind of the wealth of the Ottoman Empire he talks about up here. Luxurious habits, exhausted resources, broken spirits, a raw and insubordinate soldiery, and greedy quarrels. There is no regard for discipline, license runs riot, and men indulge in drunkenness and debauchery, and worst of all, the enemy is accustomed to victory, we to defeat. Can we doubt what the result must be? Pretty much saying here that any large-scale sustained conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the European powers was going to lead to victory for the Ottoman Empire because of all the kind of qualities he lists above here, and of course kind of debasing the effectiveness of their European counterparts. Once more, perhaps not 100% accurate for all the armies in Europe, but it is interesting that he is drawing this comparison and is placing the Ottoman Empire militarily and organizedly and structurally on kind of such a higher level than the empires that he's used to, or the kingdoms that he's used to. Finally, moving down once more to this idea and making this comparison of the meritocracy between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. He says, they, meaning the Ottomans, do not believe that high qualities are either natural or hereditary, nor do they think that they can be handed down from father to son, kind of the idea of primogeniture, which is so popular within Europe at this point in time. But that they are partially the gift of God, and partially the result of good training, great industry, and unwearied zeal. So really talking that the presence and the idea within the Ottoman Empire is that partially they're gifts that people are naturally born with, they attribute that to God, and partially the training, the hard work, and the industry, rather than thinking that good qualities are simply handed down from father to son, or kind of through the family line, as was very commonplace within Europe at this point in time. Think about the vast power that the aristocracy held within these kingdoms, how oftentimes the aristocracy were the ones who were in government positions, who were running the empires, and a lot of times this was regardless of how good they actually were at their job. Same thing within the military, they were the ones leading the military, and this is another distinction that Busbecq makes here between the Ottoman Empire and the European countries, is that the Ottomans are run much more on merit rather than simply being appointed based on birth. And once more, he backs this up at the end. He says, "This is the reason that they are successful in their undertakings, that they lord it over others, and are daily extending their bounds of the empire. These are not our ideas. With us, there is no opening left for merit. Birth is the standard for everything. The prestige of birth is the sole key to advancement in public service." Once more, not saying that there was no hierarchy within the Ottoman Empire, there certainly was, but he's certainly saying here, particularly in public service, that there's far more roles for advancement within the Ottoman Empire than there was within most of the European kingdoms at this point in time. Alright, moving on to question number 3. What aspect of Ottoman culture, religion, or society do you find the most interesting, and why? And I just picked out a couple of the areas that you had identified that I thought would be good to bring back up. The first one is in this first area where he's talking about the Janissaries. He says, "They are scattered through every part of the empire, either to garrison the forts against the enemy, or to protect Christians and Jews from the violence of the mob." Now, we had already mentioned earlier about how the Ottoman Empire in general was a lot more tolerant of religion than European empires were. And this kind of backs that up, the idea that there's actually an organized, systematic method of protecting people of religious minorities. Certainly, of course, the fact that they need protection suggests that there is still violence and there is still intolerance within society. But the fact that at the highest level there seems to be an effort to combat that is something you really do not see at all within Europe at this point in time, where anyone who is not a Christian is oftentimes being persecuted, hunted after, or in some other way, shape, or form separated from the rest of Christian society. And is usually persecuted against or forced to convert, if you think about the actions of the Inquisition, for example. Moving down here, talking once more about the difference within the armies and how Busbecq really feels that the Ottoman Empire's army is advanced or more well-trained or better than the European armies. And right after he says here that we can doubt what the result must be, essentially saying that the Ottoman Empire in a sustained conflict would triumph over Europe, it's very interesting where he accredits that this has not already happened. He says the only obstacle is Persia, remember the Safavid Empire, whose position on his rear forces the invader to take precautions. The fear of Persia gives us respite, but it is only for a time. And really here he is crediting the Safavid Empire applying pressure on kind of the opposite side of the Ottoman Empire for the only real reason that the Ottoman Empire has not already conquered Europe, which I think is pretty interesting. May not be 100% accurate, but I think it certainly plays a point that if the Ottoman Empire did not have to fear an invading force on one of their borders, it's entirely possible they could have put a lot more pressure on Europe. And we saw with the Siege of Vienna how close they ultimately came to kind of breaking through into the Holy Roman Empire, and who knows where it would have extended from there. So I think it's interesting how much credit the author here gives to the fact that essentially they're kind of fighting a two-front war, and that is why they haven't been more successful. But if it was a one-on-one matchup, that Europe would be in real serious trouble. Finally, a lot of people really pointed out this idea of the meritocracy, and a couple more quotes that back this up. He says, "In making his appointments, the Sultan pays no regard to any pretensions on the score of wealth or rank, nor does he take into consideration recommendations or popularity. He considers each case on its own merits and examines carefully into the character, ability, and disposition of the man whose promotion is in question. It is by merit that men rise in the service, a system which ensures that posts should only be assigned to the competent." Of course, he's making a comparison that this is not the way it's currently being run in Europe, and it might not be as glowing as he makes it sound here, that there was still nepotism within the Ottoman Empire, but that there was more of a chance of people being recognized for their hard work and for their merits and being promoted within the Ottoman Empire than existed within Europe. Okay, that is everything for this week. Thank you all very much, and of course, as always, if you have any questions about the document exercise, the PowerPoint questions, your grades, or anything else, contact me, let me know. Have a great week.